We're here to talk about plague, a terrifying but fascinating subject that evokes crosses on doors and the terrifying cry, "Bring out your dead." What lured you to the subject?
I'm an environmental historian, and critical to everything that I do within that is trying to get an understanding of the interactions between people and the wider environment around them. Most folk think about this maybe in terms of climate change and weather impacts, but we've also got to remember that disease, pathogens, are affecting human, animal populations, and also trees and plants and things like that as well. But you need to look at the environment in the round.
So when does Scotland's significant plague history begin?
1349. It's people in Scotland had probably been aware that plague was spreading westwards across Europe for a couple of years prior to that. And when it arrives in England the previous year, the Scots are absolutely dancing up and down with glee, calling it the foul death of the English.
Oh dear, that doesn't show us in a good light, does it?
Well, but remember, this is the middle of the second phase of the Wars of Independence. So, this is the enemy has been inflicted with this horrible disease, and this is God's judgment. Clearly, it's God's judgment. Everybody knows that God's on the side of the Scots.
So that was, how bad was that first wave of plague here?
Well, again, this is one of the problems with the understatement that you get in a lot of the sources. John of Fordoun's Chronicle, which is our earliest surviving text, speaks about a third. And all that really means is a huge number of people. He had no idea how many had actually died.
So he was implying a third of the population died?
A third of the population died. And in a lot of the modern analysis, that type of figure is the one that tended to be bandied around until folks started to dig into things in other countries, looking at death registers where they existed and wills and testaments, and you began to get an indication that it was actually significantly worse. If only 30% of your population died, you got off lightly, and you could be looking at upwards of 60, 70%, and in some locations, possibly even as high as 80. Rare cases, but generally you're looking at somewhere between 60 and 70% might have died in the first epidemic.
Good grief, no wonder it was known as the Great Mortality. Now,
Yep.
As far as Scotland's concerned, is it correct that the next wave, if you like, came about 12 years later?
Yeah, it's back in the early 1360s, and we actually know more about that, the second death, as it's usually referred to, than we do about the first one. And then after it's coming back every 7 to 10 years through the remainder of the 14th century. And each time it's given a number. And then suddenly in the early 15th century, because it's quite obvious this is something that's just going to keep on coming, they stop numbering them. And it just becomes a fact of life and death, another fact of life and death.
Well, you mentioned the fact that it was looked upon as something that came about if you were badly behaved, or that it was God's will. And I found something from the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland that really summed this up. And it gave a list of the misdemeanours that caused plague, and I'll read you a bit. Through swearing, perjury, lies, profaning on the Sabbath, with markets, gluttony, drunkenness, fighting, dancing, playing, rebelling against magistrates and laws of the country, with incest, fornication, adulteries, sacrilege, theft and oppression, with false witness, and finally with all kind of impiety and wrong. So a bit of a catch-all there, I would imagine.
But it's describing a decent Friday night out in Glasgow. What you've got here is part of that whole godly society aspect, that things that were seen as being even slightly morally dubious were seen as potentially opening the door to divine judgment, and divine judgment would mean plague. So anything at all that is potentially exposing you to this suggestion that you might be behaving in a less than proper manner, that has to be clamped out. And there's a tendency to forget as historians, we have a tendency to look at the political and the social side of it, and forgetting that the religious side of it is actually in the medieval and through into the post-medieval period is as important, if not more important, in people's lives.
They were the top
So
dogs. Yes.
Yeah, but it's also the first thing that, if you look even in the original Acts of Parliament that are concerned about trying to control plague spread, embedded into the Parliamentary Acts, you have got religious processions, prayers, masses being said, the bishops to lead within the dioceses. So it's a spiritual cure that is being sought for first and foremost, and then everything else is the belt and braces. Let's clear up the mess, let's get rid of vermin, let's prevent people moving around, that kind of thing. But it's the spiritual one is the first focus.
So who did it kill? Can we characterise it? Was it the elderly, the young, the vulnerable? And how did it kill?
Well, that's an interesting question, Jackie, because the accounts vary. And one of the most interesting things is actually, again, looking at that second and then the third pandemics, is it talks about, for example, the second one is the plague of young men. So there seems to be a gender differential coming in there. Also that it's younger people. Now, this may be that somehow or other they are more vulnerable. Their immune systems have somehow been compromised. But what we've got is, across the piece, it affected regardless of your age, your gender, your social status. The only thing that perhaps protected the rich more was that they could move, they could get away, they could perhaps run faster and further than your average townsman or countrywoman. So you're seeing a great leveller, I think is perhaps the best way to put it. There's a lot of suggestion that the impact in the first of the outbreaks in the late 1340s, early 1350s may have been worsened by the fact that would have been the adult generation who'd lived through what was known as the Great European Famine. Earlier in the 14th century, when the climate had really begun to deteriorate badly, there's a pan-European famine. In Scotland, we tend to call it just a dearth because it was already bad here and only got slightly worse. But it still meant the folk are undernourished. And there is a possible correlation in that they may have been, immunosuppressed, compromised, the same kind of way in which we saw people who were more at risk from COVID, for example. So across the piece, we've got a suggestion that people who may have had some underlying weaknesses, health conditions, general vulnerability, but it's also affecting folk who we would regard as fit, healthy, young, active. And it kills them just as fast and just as efficiently as the elderly, as the sick.
And we've all seen the dramas. We've all seen the boils, the terrible boils. Is that representative? Is that what it was like?
Yeah, yes. Almost without question. The sources are telling us that you're getting these great swellings, the buboes.
Hence bubonic plague, yes.
Hence bubonic plague. And these tend to be in the primary lymph nodes in the neck, armpit and the groin. Now, the big debate was whether the bubonic plague, as we know it, was what was around in the medieval period. That's been hypothesized since the late 19th century, but it's only just in the last couple of years that the DNA analysis has been done that has finally identified, the genome sequences have been identified that demonstrate that the medieval plague was bubonic. So we can now, with a degree of confidence, start to look at the way in which the symptoms are being described in the contemporary sources and see, yep, that is, it tallies. And where there's deviation from that, as you said earlier, There are other diseases around as well, and it's quite likely that alongside the bubonic plague, when it's floating around, we've got a whole cocktail of other things happening as well. And the bubonic one is just the most terrible visitor out of a whole series of other unwelcome guests.
Richard, the Act of 1456. Tell me about that.
This is the first piece of anti-plague legislation anywhere in the British Isles. It's an act of a General Council of Scotland. It's not a full Parliament. That's just me being pedantic. But you've got this act that is produced, and it's drawing on practices that had already begun to develop in mainland Europe, mainly in Italy and in France. And these... Nowadays, we would think of them as public health and public hygiene enactments, but there's also the spiritual dimension is included in there, with the requirement for the clergy to be performing processions and all the rest of it. But this is a really, really important act. If you ever look at it, it's unbelievably short, because it's what's we would class now as a piece of enabling legislation. So it sets out, right, these are the basic things you need to do, and then it says, so local authorities, it's your responsibility to deal with this, because you need the local legislators, the local governors, to be empowered to actually take strong action to stop plague spreading nationally. And what they're looking at is, as I say, measures that have been tried and tested. The Italian city-states have been at this game from the 1380s, 1390s. So 60 years later, the Scots have picked this up. But the emphasis as well is that it's another 60 years before there's similar legislation enacted in England. And England suffered much greater frequency and much greater intensity of plague in that period. But there's no. But then again, they were having a civil war, so things do get in the way. But Scotland was very much ahead of the game, and it's partly to do with the way in which Scotland has got this strong relationship with Europe, and a lot of knowledge exchange back and forward along the communication routes down into Rome, basically.
And as you say, the act was quite short, and it was basically quarantine containment, things which, and I'm sure listeners are the same, as you hear this, it's not just from the pages of history, because we've all experienced something very similar, at least in terms of the regulations, very recently. Yep. So containment, quarantine, and this is when we get the human stories. This is when we start to find out about how people reacted because of the contraventions. Give me some of the human stories.
Well, right. First and foremost, you mentioned quarantine, and bear in mind that they were talking real quarantine, not 14 days. This was 40 days. So if there was any indication of somebody within the household possibly, not even definitely, possibly having plague, so if somebody developed an unexplained fever, that had to be reported, and your entire household would be put into quarantine. Now, this then had the impact on individuals that they can't go about their daily business. There's no state aid, there's no support. So how do you live? You're having to draw on whatever resources you've got available to you. You're not able to communicate with anyone outside your house except through the medium of the watchmen, who have been charged to look after the neighbourhood in which you are. So you get cases like this. There's one early 17th century case up in Elgin in Moray, where it's the plague wasn't in the borough, it was in the villages outside the borough. So there was a prohibition on communication between the country dwellers and the townsfolk. There's a young woman in Elgin who has a boyfriend in one of these communities outside. So she, against the regulation, sneaks out at night, goes to see him. And this is where everybody says, oh, and of course she gets the plague and brings it back into town. No, she didn't. That's the saddest part of the story. She comes back in fit and well, but it's discovered that she has breached the regulation. So she's flogged, branded and thrown out of the town permanently because she's endangered the lives of everybody else. the most extreme cases, the town council minutes of Edinburgh have got some really, really juicy stories. You've got 2 women who were publicly drowned in the quarry holes because they'd gone into a house where there had been plague deaths, removed bedding, and were shaking the bedding out prior to selling it. And because they had, again, because of that belief that cloth may contain this horrible disease, that they were releasing this into the air and endangering their fellow townsfolk. They're drowned. There's a tailor who kept it quiet that his wife was in bed at home with plague, and then she dies. He still tells nobody. He goes to attend mass in St Giles. So this is the great, the chief mass of the day. You've got most of the burgesses in there, and it transpires afterwards that his wife's dead. So he's sentenced to be hanged at his front door. The rope breaks, so they hang him again. The rope breaks again. And eventually they decide that, well, clearly God doesn't want him to die, so we'll just brand him on the face, flog him, and expel him from the town with his bairns, as the record puts it. And that's him becoming a vagrant, economically destitute, with children. But it's the fact that he had endangered everybody else by his actions.
When did plague die out in Scotland, and why?
Well, I'll deal with the second bit first. We don't actually really know why. It was in decline anyway through the 17th century. Scotland's first indication that it was on the way out is the last epidemic that we know of, apart from a brief thing that we won't talk about in Glasgow in 1900. But you've got the 1645 to 48 epidemic, which occurs in the middle of the Civil War, and it's really nasty. This is one of the worst outbreaks there had been for decades, and it's made worse by the war. Everybody can see that it's, you've got the movement of people, refugees, armies, lots of folk crowding together. So there's a lot of concern that disease will be around for a long time yet. And then the 1640s come and go. 1650s, there's plague in England, doesn't make it to Scotland. 1665, the Great Plague in London, doesn't make it to Scotland. And people are beginning to think, something's changing here. By the time you get into the 1680s, 1690s, it's clear that it's not come back to England either, but it's still rife on the continent. So the last big epidemic, Western Europe, the 1720s down in the south of France, 1780s in Moscow. But after that, it becomes something that you get in North Africa, the Middle East. It's just gradually receding. And it's not because we've done anything like develop antibiotics. It's possibly because people are becoming much more rigorous about anti-plague enforcement, much more aware of different ways of dealing with those public hygiene aspects in terms of street cleansing and things of that sort.
After what we've gone through over the past few years with COVID, do you think a few centuries hence, COVID, which loomed so very largely in our lives, will be almost forgotten or just a footnote in history?
I don't think it will be a footnote in history, because if you look at some of the wider ramifications of it, it has that economic knock on global conditions. It's one of these situations, as a historian, I'm bound to say, we need to give it a few years to actually see how this plays out. But no, I don't think it's going to be just a footnote in history. It will be one of these global phenomena in not quite the same level as the Spanish flu epidemic, for example. But something that we need to be thankful in the UK that we got off as lightly as we did. And if you look at some of the other countries around the world where the impact was much more significant, I don't think we'll be allowed to forget that COVID-19 was a transformative episode. And, well, let's hope that, certainly in my lifetime, we don't have anything similar coming along again.
Well, that is a wise note on which to end. Professor Richard Oram, plague man extraordinaire, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
And if the walls of Gladstone land could talk, I bet they would have a tale or two to tell. It is so worth a visit. Opening times and details of events can be found on the Trust website, nts.org.uk. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the Love Scotland podcast. Just click on the button and each episode will download for free and be there for you to hopefully enjoy whenever you feel like it. I will be back with another episode soon. Until then, goodbye.